Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story about a barrel that was never meant to be opened. There is something about a wine cellar at the end of summer that feels like the inside of a held breath. The temperature drops as you descend, not harshly, not suddenly, but with a gradual certainty, as if the earth itself is reminding you that you are going deeper now, that the rules up above do not entirely apply. Here, the smell changes too. Stone and oak and something older than either, a dark mineral sweetness that clings to the walls and doesn't quite let go. You breathe it in, and it breathes you back. António had been descending into this cellar since he was 6 years old. He knew its every step, every shadow, every sound. He knew how the wooden door swelled in the rainy months and caught against the frame. He knew which flagstone near the bottom had a slight dip in its center and would hold a small puddle after damp weather. He knew the way the single bulb near the entrance cast its yellow light only so far, and how, beyond that point, you relied on the string of low lamps along the left wall, each one just barely bright enough to illuminate the barrel in front of it, but not the space between. He knew the cellar, the way you know your own body, without thought, without effort, by feel alone. And yet, there was one thing in it he had never touched. At the far end of the oldest section, past the newer barrels with their chalk labels and their careful dates, past the medium-aged rows he checked each month, past the one that had split 3 winters ago and left a long, dark stain on the stone floor that never fully dried, there was a barrel that had no label, no date, no mark of any kind. It was older than the others, clearly. The wood had darkened to something close to black in places, and the iron bands around it had turned the deep rust red of old blood. It sat slightly apart from its neighbors, not by much, perhaps the width of a hand, but enough that, over the years, António had come to think of it as separate. A different kind of thing. He had never touched it. He had never opened it. He had never racked it or tested it or held a light to the bung to check for seepage. He simply walked past it, the way you walk past a stranger on the street who is standing too still, who is watching something you cannot see. Not because you are afraid exactly, but because some part of you has already decided that whatever they are doing is not for you to know. António had never asked himself why he felt this way. He had simply always known. The barrel at the end is not to be opened. He had not been told. His father had not sat him down and explained. His grandfather, from whom the vineyard had passed, and before that, his grandfather's grandfather, stretching back through the soft slopes of the Douro Valley for more generations than the family kept careful records of. None of them had written anything down. There were no signs, no locked chains, no warnings preserved in anyone's handwriting on yellowing paper. There was only the knowing, the way that certain knowledge passes from one person to another, not through words, but through something quieter. A glance held a moment longer than necessary. A hand that steers you gently in a different direction. A silence that has the shape of an answer, even when no question has been asked. And so, António had grown up knowing, without knowing how he knew. He might never have thought about it at if his sun hadn't come down. Miguel was 17 that autumn, old enough to start learning in earnest, old enough to have the cellar explained to him properly. The racking schedule, the seasonal checks, the way you listened to a barrel before you opened it, the patience that winemaking required of a person, and that winemaking, over time, built back into them. António had brought him down on a Tuesday evening, when the harvest was done and the cellar was quiet, and had walked him through it, row by row. Miguel was a careful listener. He walked slowly and touched the barrels lightly with the flat of his palm, the way António had shown him, feeling for temperature, for vibration, for the small signs of a barrel's health that a good winemaker learned to read without instruments. He asked sensible questions. He had his grandfather's eyes, António thought. That particular quality of attention that made you feel fully seen. They reached the end of the oldest section. Miguel stopped in front of the unlabeled barrel. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in the mild, curious tone of someone asking about the weather, "What's in that one?" António opened his mouth to answer, and then he stopped. He stood very still. The low lamp on the wall to his left cast its small orange circle on the stone floor. Beyond it, the rest of the cellar continued in its careful dimness. The smell of oak and earth hung gently in the cool air. He did not know what to say. Not because the question was difficult, not because he had forgotten, but because, for the first time in his life, he was looking at the thing he knew and trying to trace it back to its source, and finding nothing there. No memory, no conversation, no moment in which someone had taken him aside and explained. "We don't open that one," he said finally. Miguel looked at him. "Why not?" And António said quietly, "I don't know." He had never said those 3 words about this barrel before. He had never had to. The knowing had always been enough, self-contained, self-sufficient, requiring no justification. But now he had said them aloud, and they had a different weight to them. They settled in the air of the cellar. They didn't dissolve. They finished the inspection in near silence. António pointed things out and answered questions, and his voice was steady and calm and professional. And the whole while the back of his mind was doing something quiet and persistent, like a thread being slowly pulled. He didn't know why they didn't open the barrel. He had never asked. That evening, after Miguel had gone to bed, António sat in the kitchen with a glass of wine from a different year and stared at the table for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called his father. His father was 81. He lived in a small house in the village below the vineyard. And he answered his phone on the 3rd ring the way he always had, with a brief yes that carried the implication that he'd been expecting the call eventually. António said, "Papa, the old barrel, the one at the back of the cellar, the one without a label. I brought Miguel down today, and he asked about it, and I realized I've never known. Why do we leave it? What's in it?" There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not the silence of someone thinking. Not the silence of someone searching for words. A different kind of silence. The kind that has already decided what it is, and is simply taking a moment before it speaks. Then his father said slowly, "Your grandfather told me about that barrel when I was very young, maybe 7 or 8. And the thing he told me, the only thing, Antonio, because there wasn't much more he could say, was this. A pause. Something is in it. Not wine. Something that needed to be kept sealed. My father told him the same thing, and his father before that, and so on back to whenever it was sealed. And the rule, the only rule that was ever passed down, was the day it stops moving, you'll know it's safe to open. Antonio sat very still in his kitchen. It's still moving, isn't it? His father did not phrase it as a question. Antonio thought of the last time he had passed the barrel. He thought of the walk through the cellar earlier that evening. Miguel beside him, the low lamps, the smell of oak. He thought of the moment when they'd both stood in front of it. And he tried to remember whether, standing there, he had noticed anything. A sound, a feeling, anything at all. He said, I don't know. I've never checked. His father was quiet for a moment longer. Then carefully, you should go and check. And then his father said goodnight, and the call ended. Antonio sat at the table for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The wine in his glass had gone still. Outside, through the window, the Douro Valley was dark and terraced and enormous and quiet, the vines invisible in the night but present. You could feel them, the way you always feel the land that holds you when you have lived on it long enough. The river somewhere below, slow and silver in the dark. The stars above the ridge, cold and far away. He got up. He put on his coat. He took the cellar key from the hook beside the door. The night was cold and damp, and smelled of the last of the harvest. That sweet, slightly fermented smell that clung to everything in October, and wouldn't quite leave until November. His footsteps on the stone path were soft. The door to the cellar was where it always was. He unlocked it. He felt it swell slightly against the frame, the familiar resistance, and then it opened. He went down. The cellar was exactly as he had left it a few hours before. The lamps were still on. He always left the low ones burning on inspection days. The barrels stood in their rows, dark and patient, and breathing in their slow way. The wood expanding and contracting with the temperature. The wine within them, doing its long, quiet work. He walked through them without hurrying. Past the chalk labels, past the dated rows, past the dark stain on the floor. He reached the end of the oldest section. The unlabeled barrel was there, as it had always been. Darker than the others, bands rusted deep red, set slightly apart. The lamp beside it threw its small circle of orange light on the stone floor. And in that light, the barrel looked, as it always looked, like something that had been waiting long enough to have stopped being in a hurry. Antonio stood in front of it for a moment. Then he reached out and placed his hand flat against the wood. The wood was cool, smooth in the way that very old wood becomes smooth, not polished, not finished, but worn by time into something almost soft. He pressed his palm against it and felt the grain beneath his skin, and then he felt it. It was slight, very slight, less than a vibration, more than stillness, something between the two. A quality of the wood that suggested movement without quite being movement, the way a sleeping chest suggests breathing without the rise and fall being visible from across the room. It was the feeling of something that was not entirely settled, something ongoing, something inside the barrel that had not yet finished whatever it was doing. Antonio stood with his hand against the wood and did not move. He was not cold. The cellar was cold, but he had stopped feeling it. He was only feeling the wood beneath his palm, and what was beneath the wood, that faint, persistent quality of motion. So gentle it was almost kind, almost reassuring. In the same way a heartbeat is reassuring when you are listening for it in the dark and you find it. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about his grandfather's grandfather. He thought about the unbroken line of men and women who had walked through this cellar and past this barrel and carried in their bodies the same knowledge he carried, the knowledge that had no source, no explanation, no written record, only the rule, only the single instruction passed down through silence and glance and implication, across more generations than he could count. The day it stops moving, you'll know it's safe to open. He stood there for a long time, long enough for the cold to find him again, long enough for the lamp to his left to flicker once, softly, and settle. He did not open the barrel. He stepped back. He looked at it for a moment, the dark wood, the rusted bands, the slight distance it kept from its neighbors, the way it sat in the half-light of the oldest part of the cellar, as though it had always been there and would go on being there long after everything else had changed. He looked at it the way you look at something you have carried your whole life without noticing its weight, and are now, for the first time, feeling it. He turned. He walked back through the cellar. He climbed the steps. He locked the door behind him. Outside, the valley was the same as it had always been, dark and vast and patient. The vines invisible but present. The river below, moving slowly towards somewhere it had always been going. The stars above the ridge. He stood on the path for a moment and breathed the night air. He would tell Miguel. Not everything. There wasn't everything to tell. But what there was. The rule. The barrel. The reason they walked past it and did not stop. He would pass it down the way it had always been. Passed down. Not as a fear. Not as a warning. But as a simple fact of the cellar. One of the things you know because you have been taught to know it. One of the truths that runs beneath the surface of a family the way the river runs beneath the valley. Always there, mostly unseen, shaping everything. He would tell Miguel, one day it will be still, and on that day, if that day ever comes, perhaps you will finally know what was inside it. But not today. Today. And for all the days he could imagine stretching ahead of him, the barrel was still moving, very slightly, from inside. Thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even the oldest things have not yet finished their work. If the stillness stayed with you, if the cool air of that cellar settled somewhere deep, then let it remain a little while longer. Some things, after all, are not yet ready to be known. They are only ever meant to be kept. Rest now, the valley will watch over the night.